Hi everyone, it's your old pal TJ, and I'm here to review Bullet Train with ease. Ease, of course, standing for effort, audacity, stimulation, and execution. For me, these are the most important aspects for discussing a film and whether or not it's good. Of course, this is completely subjective, but over the years, I've found that when it comes to liking a film or loving a film, it often comes down to how those four different factors play into each other. So let's not waste any more time and focus a keen eye on David Leitch's Bullet Train. Bullet Train stars Brad Pitt as Ladybug, the unluckiest snatch-and-grab operative to ever set foot in Japan. His latest mission to steal a briefcase on a bullet train goes horribly awry thanks to a number of other operatives and assassins all being on the same train with their own missions to complete. To recount the story any further would lead us into major spoiler territory, so I'm just going to leave things there because I don't want to spoil things for you. There's a lot of fun things that happen in this movie, and I'm not that kind of person. I'm not an evil guy. So first, let's talk about effort, and this refers to the subjective feeling as to whether or not the people involved in the film actually gave a damn about what they were producing. I'm talking about the actors, the directors, the producers, the studio involved. Did they actually care about the film, or did they just see this as an opportunity to make a bunch of money and everyone just showed up to make their money and that was it? And I'm happy to report that everyone involved in Bullet Train put their best foot forward. All of the performers commit to their borderline wacky personas. The fight sequences are well choreographed and feel appropriately brutal in most cases. And the narrative took a tongue-in-cheek approach to the idea of fate and how it relates to the cause and effect relationships that are at the center of most stories. So hats off to the writers for their efforts. I would say that pretty much everyone was fully checked in when they were making this film, except there are some issues with VFX throughout the film, especially at the end, but we'll probably talk about that a little bit later. But I'm okay with this for the most part because of all of the stuff that we have heard about what Marvel has been putting their CGI artists, their VFX artists through. So I kind of understand why some of these VFX are not as good as they could be, and it largely has to do with budget constraints and time constraints, and is not the actual fault of the VFX artists. By the way, VFX artists, have you considered forming a union? You might want to try that. Next up is audacity, and this can refer to many different aspects of the filmmaking process, but it generally refers to risk. A good way of thinking about this is that after you finished watching the film, would you consider that it was a risky film to make? So the next time you're walking out of a theater, think to yourself, was that film a risk to make, or did the studio take the safest route possible? If you're walking out of an MCU film, the answer is always safe. For an example, on the other side, there's Everything Everywhere All at Once. That film is an absolute masterclass in taking risks. The audacity of that film is off the charts. And I would say the Bullet Train is less audacious than Everything Everywhere All at Once, but let's be honest, so are most films. But I did feel like there were still risks being taken with this film. For example, the fact that it was a hard R action movie with lots of profanity, lots of blood, and lots of gore. I have a feeling that Sony, the studio that produced this, actually had to think to themselves, how much money are we willing to leave on the table by not allowing teenagers in to see this film? We also have to point out the fact that this is a film that doesn't really have a lot of lore behind it. It doesn't have a lot of pre-established love for its property. It is an adaptation, but as an individual film, it's not drawing on the storylines of 20 past films or decades and decades worth of stories already told. It is, for all intents and purposes, a standalone film, which in this day and age is absolutely a risk. To Sony's credit, they mitigated this risk by including as many top-tier actors as they possibly could, including the likes of Brad Pitt, Sandra Bullock, and a few more that I won't mention because that would bring us into spoiler territory. And finally, when it comes to the audacity of this film, I have to talk about the script once again, because this script does something that not a lot of other scripts do. It plays with the idea of Chekhov's gun, the idea that if you show a gun in the first act, then someone has to be shot by that gun in the third act, but it does so with lots of different things. There are many, many Chekhov guns in this film. In fact, it's basically an entire masterclass in the setup and payoff of Chekhov's gun. And doing this, I think, is a risk, because if you do it improperly, it just works out so terribly for you. Like, people will go back through it and find all the different things that you didn't pay off, and then that is what people are going to remember, as opposed to all of the clever little things that you thought you did. But upon first viewing, I'm willing to say that they paid off every single thing that they set up. And in fact, while watching through the trailers a couple of times before sitting down and doing this review, I noticed a couple of other things that were actually set up that were a lot more subtle. And so there was probably things in here that I didn't even see the first time being set up and paid off. So kudos to the writers for taking the risk and putting that much effort into all of these different things that need to seamlessly work in order for the film to work. And kudos to the director for saying this is going to be super easy, barely an inconvenience. Next, I'm going to talk about stimulation, or what did this film make me feel? And Bullet Train, as I'm sure you could tell by the trailers, is an action comedy. So right off the bat, we know that it's either got to make me laugh, or it's got to make me feel all kinds of joy and glee as people get blown up and shot and all that kind of stuff. And in a lot of ways, this film does feel like a Guy Ritchie film, at least back when Guy Ritchie was making good movies. Each character contributes to the comedy and action in equal measure, which is actually quite impressive to see considering the range that is required to do that. This film really doesn't have comedic relief because everyone in their own right is funny, with the exception of maybe Bad Bunny, but he's not trying to be funny. In fact, I would say that his character is almost like dramatic relief. He brings actual emotional stakes into the film when he enters it. So yeah, dramatic relief. I'm copywriting that. So the film does have comedic parts and I was laughing, so I'm going to count that as half of a stimulation point for Bullet Train. But then what about all of the grueling action sequences? Did they leave me feeling thrilled and saying to myself, oh god, that really must have hurt? And frankly, yeah, I said that quite a bit. There are some wonderful action sequences in this film, and since most of it is contained to a train, you're getting different kinds of action sequences than you're used to. If you see a lot of big budget action films, not many of those action sequences are likely taking place inside confined spaces. They are out in space, or they are on a big sweeping planet, or they are in a grassy field. Like, there's just not many times where you're fighting in a confined space. And so the style of action, the style of fighting that you see here is a lot more brutal, it's a lot more improvisational, and so I think that actually helps separate Bullet Train from other action movies. And yeah, there were definitely moments in this when I was cringing and saying, oh god, that must have really hurt. Like, it looked like some of the actors and stunt doubles really took some bumps in this film. So once again, kudos to you for sacrificing your body so that my cold, dead heart could feel something. And now we get to execution, which to me is the most important aspect out of everything that I have talked about, because this is where we get the difference between a well-made, really good film and a film that is so bad that it's good. Think about movies like The Room.
Oh, hi, Mark.
Or Miami Connection. A lot of effort was put into those films, and there was certainly a lot of risk taken, and there was certainly some stimulating moments, but the execution was so poor, those films were quickly relegated to they're so bad, they're good. But in the case of Bullet Train, the execution was pulled off quite well, so I would say it's so good, it's good, with some minor exceptions. And yes, these will mostly be nitpicks, but I do need to point them out. First is the fight choreography. I mentioned earlier how it was very brutal and improvisational, and I really liked how those fights were set up, with the exception of the fight that is alluded to in the trailers between Brad Pitt and Tyree Henry. That fight in particular has an Edgar Wright feel to it, where it was very heavily choreographed, and I felt that it didn't really fit into the overall feeling of the film. It just felt a little bit out of place considering all of the other brutal beatdowns we were getting. And this is a criticism that I would also levy at a film like John Wick 3. I feel like if you over-choreograph some of these action scenes, they just come off feeling a bit cheaper and a bit slower and not as snappy as they need to be. So filmmakers in the future, please watch out for that. Nitpick number 2 has to do with how the film is structured. In the first act, all of our characters are basically separate from each other, and so the film very deliberately will just stop one person's story and then go and show you someone else's story for a few minutes and then go back to that first person's story. And in this case, some of those stops are happening right when an action sequence is starting. So it feels a little bit weird when we're getting a setup for what we think is going to be a really cool fight, and then we have to wait for 5 minutes during a dialogue sequence, and then eventually we get back to that action sequence and everything just keeps going on in real time. I would have preferred if the film tried to marry these sections together a little bit easier so it wasn't so jarring going from one sequence to the next and having a bit of a confusing time thing going on because of it, but as the film goes on, the stories become more and more integrated, so that becomes less of a problem. And for my final nitpick, oh my god, some of the VFX in this film are fucking terrible. And unfortunately, one of those very specific moments is one of the very last shots of the film, so it is going to be a moment that sticks with you. For those of you who have seen the film, you probably know the one that I'm talking about, and for those of you who haven't, just keep an eye out for it. It's basically right at the end of the film, and it involves something not very great happening to a car. But once again, I do not want to throw VFX artists under the bus, because looking at that shot, I just know that it could have been made better if only they had the time and the money to actually do it properly. So that to me is solely on the studio for not allowing that and for keeping their hands on the purse strings a little too tightly. Is that even a saying? I don't even think that was proper English, but I think you understand what I'm saying. But like, that's it. Those are my issues with this film. Everything else was really good. I was actually really surprised by this film, especially when you start getting into the second and third acts. The momentum of the film really starts getting going, and when it really starts to get going, you're just getting escalating action sequence after escalating action sequence. A lot of the acting and interactions between the performers are wonderful. You do get that kind of Guy Ritchie-esque dialogue at certain points of the film, which is kind of nice. And I just left the theater feeling really good about that film. It was genuinely a film that I was surprised by, which is weird because I went into it with fairly high expectations already. I had decided very early on when I saw the first trailer that this was one of my favoriteest movies of the year, or at least one of the ones that I was looking forward to the most. And then when it actually delivered, but in ways that I wasn't expecting, I was pleasantly surprised. So yeah, it's good, but not in the ways that you think it's going to be good. And also, just for reference, you can definitely tell this was directed by the guy who made Deadpool 2, but it is a far superior film to Deadpool 2. So if you're a fan of that film, get in line for Bullet Train right goddamn now, because this is definitely your shit. But that's it from me. Please let me know what you thought about this film in the comment sections below, and let me know what you thought about this review. I don't often do longer reviews, but maybe I'll do more of them if you like this video. And hey, subscribe to the channel anyways, because I like making content like this, so you should come back and hang out.